Elena Asciuti, which has done many emissions in the past. So I'm very glad to be here and starting this 1 hour long session where we'll be interviewing different panelists that during this morning and early afternoon have talked about many different political and research related topics that we're researching here at the EY. Hello, Elena.
Hello, good afternoon, buon après-midi, buon pomeriggio. I'm Elena Schutt, indeed, Alexander. I'm very familiar to this fantastic radio pass because every 2 Fridays I run the radio show called Diffusione Fiaba. Allow me for 2-second advertisement, which is, I think, the oldest Radio Cavolo show, and it focuses on storytelling and the power of fairy tales even in the 21st century. So whenever you want, we are there to tell you beautiful stories. But today we want to say the story about the UI 50th anniversary, and through the protagonists, the characters of the research festival that for the first time the UI launched to celebrate indeed this very important milestone, and happy to be together with you. It will be a lot of fun.
It's a great pleasure. We've had a very long day today, started very early, and events just keep on going everywhere at the Badia. It is such a vibrant time to be here. There's high-level speakers. I just saw Frans Timmermans, the big EU Green Deal guy that was here to talk about climate policy this morning. And yes, so we had heads of states yesterday. Did you manage to see the introduction ceremony yesterday?
Indeed, I was there, Alexander, and it was magnificent. Of course, to celebrate the 50th anniversary. Secondly, to reinforce the relationship with the city of Florence. Indeed, the ceremony was hosted at the Maggio Fiorentino, which is the opera theater of the beautiful city of Firenze. And when it's a theater, it's always a place where different kind of people gather besides academia. And I had a great pleasure to be the liaison contact of Professor Sabino Cassese, who was the first winner of the UI Awards for Imagining the Future of Europe. And indeed, it was a very touching ceremony, even because we had an experienced person like Sabino Cassese, who has been an intellectual leader through the history of Italy and Europe, and then going through several important high-level representatives from EU institutions. And at the same time, we had the next generations, because there were several students on stage from one of the many high schools in Firenze sharing their ideas of future Europe. So indeed. And did you enjoy it?
Yes, I enjoyed it very much. It's interesting you mentioned Sabino Cassese. Maybe not everyone knows that his brother is also a very good friend of the EY, as he,
Indeed.
I think, gave part of his private collection to the EY archives.
Just let me tell you that was the brother, Antonio Cassese.
Antonio Cassese,
but indeed,
exactly.
This shows
I was
a
mentioning
family.
the brother.
Sorry, my bad. And I gave it for granted because as Italian we all know the Cassese family has a very important...
I discovered that they were brothers yesterday. I had to look up on Wikipedia, and I was very surprised to see the connection.
Exactly. But as you said, very good friends and supporter of the UI. And now I think we can give the welcome to our first guest of the afternoon session, Alexander.
Yes, so we have here now Mr. Giancarlo Corsetti. Sorry for my pronunciation.
Perfect pronunciation.
Which was part of the panel the early afternoon on the European social model, knowledge for a new era. So you have co-hosted this panel this morning. Could you briefly tell us what was discussed during this panel and what are the main points that that comes out of this discussion?
Yeah, the panel was envisioned as a way to remind us that in this new world of geopolitical fragmentation and crisis, Europe has to value its own asset. And one of the assets that the euro has is the social model, the welfare state, the social security. There is a sense in which we run into difficulties because of fiscal space, because of opposition. But at the end of the day, we live in a world where more and more we have shocks and disturbances coming from abroad of increasing intensity, increasing frequency, and keeping Europe together will be one of the elements that will be essential for us to meet the challenge. Clearly, we used to think that there was a trade-off between efficiency and equity. So you get the social model by renouncing equity. There is evidence that it's not like this. Then, of course, when you open the hood and you look inside, there are issues. So like one of the presenters showed that the amount of discrimination, while the social model is really correlated to innovation and growth, especially in the Nordic countries. So there is an element which there is no trade-off between efficiency and equity. You can be equitable and efficient at the same time. When you look into discrimination, the discrimination is actually the same everywhere. And that raises issue in the fact that to have a sustainable social model, you need to have some degree of homogeneity in the society, and the some degree of homogeneity in the society may come at the cost of us and them, the kind of discrimination. This is one of the presenters. The other presenter was from the ECD, and he talks about climate and the problem that climate may create for especially the bottom part of the distribution. And there the issue is how to basically defend and compensate. And again, here is an issue because people may value status more than income. So just giving money is not enough for people losing their identity, their status. I can go on in the other two presenters, but if you want to interact,
yeah, sure. Yeah, I jump in immediately, Giancarlo, and thank you again. Grazie di nuovo for being with us this afternoon on Radio Cavolo. My question is very simple. It regards young people. First of all, how would you explain to a young person what is the social model and what kind of perspective could someone that today is 15, 20 years old have in his or her future when it comes to the social model?
That's, in general, how would you explain to people, but especially to young people, this? One point that is essential for us is that looking into the past, to the experience of our father and grandfather at this point is misleading, or it may be a source of irritation, especially the last generation. There is a sense in which we may move into something that maybe our great-grandfather experienced, which is, lifetime, changes in the trajectory in the lifetime. That's why I would explain, listen, we need to create a covenant across generation, across people, in which maybe keeping social services up, rethinking the way we give people health care, like unemployment benefit, help the accumulation of human capital, maybe moving back from a market-based explosion in the name of a fake efficiency. It is time now to rethink that. Now, it is not as easy, again, because there are issues with the amount of resources that we have. There are issues with, certain aspect in the climate, think about climate change and the weight of all people. So let me respond to with an empty slogan. The fact that the aging population is so large, to me, means that we need to invest in the young people. It's the only. So people think of the aging population as a society in which we should put resources in the old people. I think it's exactly the opposite. We should get people, entrepreneurs, taking risk, having fulfillment of their lifetime ambitions and things. Without making money is fun. Having services is fun. People have different talents and different aspirations. We need to empower these talents and aspirations. That is the way we keep the society up, I think. But this is my personal opinion.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Very much appreciated. Alexander, would you like to continue?
Yeah, that's a very hopeful vision for Europe and for its European social model. I'm going to drop right into the elephant in the room, right? Which is that all over Europe for decades now, there's this constant discussion of the welfare state is in crisis. We spend too much money on social spendings, on healthcare spending, on pension spending, and we need to cut them in order to have prosperity back. And I understand that what the research that you discussed during this panel show is that it's actually quite the opposite in some respect. Could you, for listeners, explain them why this sort of dichotomy between prosperity versus welfare is not necessarily the right way to approach the problem?
Well, again, I can tell you what I think. Now, we still need to make it possible, but the answer is basically the real bottom problem here is productivity. We have an issue especially in Europe, in making sure that we have a system that can use the resources to deliver prosperity, not to waste resources. Young unemployment, young under-education is a waste of resources. So I think those are two seemingly contradictory statements. It's true, we don't have much resources left. On the other hand, the welfare state, the social model, is an enabler of risk-taking, entrepreneurship. It can help people to move around until they get the job of which they're good at. They could help entrepreneurs to take risks, the startups. So there is a sense in which there is no contradiction there. Again, once I say this, I also tell you this will be my line of research with other people in the Institute for the next few years, but it's the bottom part is that we need to think better how not to follow the US or China. No, there is no catch up, there is no competitive problem. There is a problem of productivity, which in my view in education is basically prosperity, not to waste talent, not to waste resources. Having people, and again, I insist on the issue of status, the fact that we cannot really compensate people with money. That's actually the other problem with the welfare state in the old times.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo. And we use this moment to welcome Professor Josephine van Zeben, Professor at the UI and Provost for Education and Academic Staff Development. Thank you very much. And it's fantastic to have both of you here because one of the assets of the European University Institute is interdisciplinarity, and I think you both work on very important policy areas. I just would like to continue with Giancarlo, and then we pass to you, Josephine. You would not escape our questions. So I was wondering whether there is a good practice. I know that naming might be a dangerous exercise to perform, but whether there is a model we could inspire ourselves within the EU or even outside the EU. Would be that possible?
Social model.
Yes, a good practice, exactly.
Well, there is experience that we can draw on from the Nordic countries, like in the Florence report that is talking about interdisciplinary, 40 authors, 30 chapters, different views. Some of the authors talk about the Nordic countries, showing how basically they are all inducing more investment, more risk-taking, more productivity at the same time. They're not the same, they're different. There are countries that are more or less relatively homogeneous in the population. So replicating that in France, in Italy, in Germany may be a challenge, but this is why we call it EmuLab, in the sense it would be nice to have a kind of experimental mind to try to have a very critical, could be also a very critical review of these models. But I would start from there. I would start with the issue of flex security, and on the other hand, there is the big issue of the social, pension funds, which would be also very good for the financial side of the same problem.
Thank you very much. Alexander.
Josephine Van Zeven, welcome and congratulations for hosting this panel this morning. There was a very, very crowded room and interactive discussions. So congratulations for that. I think everyone loved it. I recall that you had a vote at the beginning and at the end of the panel regarding whether climate expertise should supersede some democratic choices. And at the end of the discussion, the room said no overall. Were you surprised by this result?
No, actually, I was very, very surprised that in the beginning, so in the initial vote, it was very tight. So we had almost, I think we had maybe 4 votes more for no than for yes. And I was really surprised by this because when we were preparing for this session, our assumption was that everybody was going to say, well, obviously, expert knowledge should not override democratic decision making. So we even, in deciding the panels, we were giving sort of, the easier argument to certain people, etc., because we were so convinced that it was going to be a very obvious, everybody thinks this shouldn't happen, right? And actually, when we were in the room, it turned out that the initial vote especially was really almost 50-50. And I think even with the second vote, the final vote, I mean, the no's had done an exceptional job in arguing the case, right? So I think they really managed to sort of change some people's minds. But even then, it wasn't the case that everybody suddenly decided that no, expert knowledge should not override democratic decision making. There was still a healthy amount of people who thought that would be a good idea. So maybe this also shows my own bias on where I stand on this. But I was very surprised actually. I think that was the most surprising thing about the whole session, that it wasn't more obvious from the beginning where people stood.
Thank you very much, Josephine. So I go back to the title of the panel, Who Decides on Our Climate? For those people that are listening and were not here in Firenze, do we have an idea? Because of course, there are the experts like you and many other colleagues here at the UI. There are the policymakers, but there are a lot of private actors that are mingling into this discussion. So if you can give us a tweak of that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So actually that is not a question that was really central to, I know it might have seemed that way, but that was not the central question of the debate. So the central question of the debate was really this tension between expert knowledge on the one hand and democratic decision making on the other hand. I think the question that you're pointing to, though, is a very crucial sort of second layer, right? Which is, what do we do with private actors? What do we do with different kinds and different levels of policymakers? What do we do with different kinds of expertise? And it was touched upon in the debate, and I think one of the examples that was brought up several times was, what do we do with the Elon Musks? What do we do, and this is a very urgent question, I think. That came out more, I think, in the discussion of what is expertise and what is democratic decision making, right? Because I think those kind of questions, however at the forefront they are within climate, they're not questions only for climate, right? I think it's a question in general, what do we do with private interests which have taken a shape and a form that is so significant now that in a way, should we treat them more with the same kind of safeguards and the same kind of scrutiny maybe that we treat some public actors, right? So I think that is a long-standing discussion, and I think it's coming to the fore now in different kind of ways, especially also when you think about AI, when we think about technology. So we did discuss that, but we didn't sadly come to a conclusion on that question because it was slightly tangential to what we discussed. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to go back on this question of what role of experts in policymaking, and maybe for both of you, you're both researchers and producing research that aim to have a policy impact. What do you think, in your experience, in your professional experience also, is the impact of the kind of research that we do at the EY, and how do policymakers listen or sometimes don't listen to what we try to explain in our works?
Well, this is basically one of the major concentration of my work. If you look at, now Josephine is from Holland, like Holland we had a major contribution by Nobel Prize called Tim Bergen, who sort of created this idea that the economics could be used as an instrument of democracy to basically listen to policymakers, derive implications and telling people what are the implications of the promise of the policymaker. And the slogan was to take the promise of the policymaker out of the slogan into reality. This was it's still there, like the Central Planning Bureau is still there, they're still doing it. Over time, what we are seeing is a major investment to deconstruct this. Actually, there are beautiful books, The Great Persuasion, that shows how over time people have invested into making sure that has been a undermining of this public service or social. I talk about economics, but I'm sure other disciplines have the same idea. So basically, at this point, we have, as of today, there is a wall of money coming from U.S. conservative that is trying to, through foundations, to install the doubt and undermine expertise. So this is why UI could be one of the strongholds of thinking not only about creating good analysis, but how to interact in the cultural policy of explaining, convincing, creating narratives, if you like this word, enriching people and policymakers. This is an open debate. It's not. There is no technical answer. It's a true. It's the politics of knowledge in a way, right? Because knowledge per se needs to be explained, needs to persuade people, and that will take time and patience, I guess.
I obviously don't have the kind of experience as, I don't want to, I'm really at the beginning, I think, of my career in terms of like making that kind of policy impact. I would be very, very grateful if I could look back and have the kind of impact, that Giancarlo's had. But I think one of the reasons for me to come to the UI was actually exactly this. So I'm at the SCG, and it's for me, it's a vehicle to have exactly that kind of collaboration. And I think before I came to the EUI, I was at a university in the Netherlands called Wageningen University, which is a life sciences university, and they do very applied, well, it's not applied, they do very fundamental research, but mostly in the life sciences, to do with agriculture, food, etc. And they have an extremely direct policy impact because part of the university is also a former research institute of the Dutch government, and there's really close ties, and there's a whole infrastructure that allows that continuous conversation between the government and the Dutch government in this case, and the research. And I think that's really something that I see now also developing within the EUI, and that I really want to learn from, because I think one of the things that I've really seen, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, is that it is very difficult to conduct a research project and then be at the end and be like, well, now I'm going to give a couple of policy papers to these people, and then they're going to just copy paste that into legislation, for example. No. That's not how it works. I mean, from my experience, from what I've seen in Wageningen and also now increasingly here and other places, is that if you want to have a policy impact, you need to design the research project with that in mind, and be sure that you bring in stakeholders, that you have the kind of questions that actually allow for that kind of impact. And I think that's something that, and I don't think every research project has to have that, right? I think there are different kinds of research projects, there's different kind of researchers, and I think, I find it incredibly satisfying to sometimes have a research project where I know the impact is going to be very concrete, and then I also deeply love sometimes having a completely abstract, theoretical, academic research project, which is really more just about, concept development and just like, very different in its application. And both, I think, can have great policy impact, but in different ways, right? So this is a...
Can I interrupt?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I see Anton coming to replace me. I want
Yeah.
to say two things.
Yes, please.
Wageningen is a powerhouse. My daughter actually went to Wageningen.
Yes.
And it's truly a good model, actually. It could be too specialized for us, but it's a model of, we live not only with silos in our discipline, but we also have silos between us, the industry. So there is a sense. And I want to tell this story. Like in 2010, Marco Del Panta, then Secretary General, came to me in the corner, and we had a cappuccino. We said, why don't we do State of the Union? He said Marco idea. And I did all the little program with research and things. And he said, no, we need to have something different. And he was completely right. So this today, the 50th anniversary comes into the development of this idea that to place the UI into a dialogue, which I think is something that we should really value and cherish, and it's one of the best things we do, and it's important for all the community, researcher and faculty, to be very much So I don't know how it will go ahead. And today is a good example. We can even multiply the idea, but in the future, I think breaking the silos will be essential for us.
Thank you,
And to this,
Giancarlo. I think this is a fantastic way to conclude, and it's a wish for the future of the UI. Indeed, yesterday we talked about the next 50 years of the UI, so I think this could already be a good wish for the future. Thank you for coming, Giancarlo. In the meanwhile, I welcome Professor Mafalda Damaso. Thank you for being with us. But we finished the interview with Josephine because you touched, together with Giancarlo, of course, a very essential point, how to break the silos, how to ensure interdisciplinarity. And you also mentioned that you are a professor at the School of Transnational Governance, where there is a master in transnational governance with students. And I made a next generation question also to Giancarlo, so Mafalda, get prepared. Because yes, 50 years, but we also need to look at the future. So how to convey this message to possible future leaders and academics that are now currently studying at the Master in Transnational Governance, because this is a kind how to forge a mindset, right? To work more across the sector, across policy. Voila. Open to you.
So nobody listens to this, right? There's not a big audience for this, right? I'm going to say some controversial things, right?
Please,
so
thank you.
I actually don't think that's a question at all, because I work with these students every day, and they come to the EY because they know that nothing that they're going to do in their professional life is going to be disciplinarily constrained, right? They need to understand the language of other disciplines. They need to be able to address these incredibly complicated problems in a way that brings in things from all kinds of disciplines. So I don't need to explain this to them at all. They come to me and they say, like, why am I doing transnational law? Why am I doing anything to do with law? Tell me how this matters for this interdisciplinary life that I'm going to lead, right? And then I try to do that. So I don't think they're the problem. I think, quite frankly, we're the problem, right? I think a lot of professors, and I say this with a lot of respect and appreciation for my colleagues, but also the academy as a whole, I think we're the problem, right? Because the issue is, if you're an academic, you are hugely rewarded for being very disciplinarily precise, right? The more niche your research, the better, right? I don't want you to be an international criminal lawyer. I want you to be an international criminal lawyer who only focuses on the International Criminal Court. You know, like, the more specific you can be in your profession, the better. And I think that's really a shame, because even though I think a lot of people have a passion for doing more interdisciplinary work, it's very difficult to build a very respected academic career by publishing the kind of work that falls between different disciplinary journals, for example, right? It's very difficult. It is also, admittedly, extremely difficult to be truly inter or multidisciplinary in your work, right? Because it means that you don't know just one language of one discipline, but you know several languages of several disciplines, several methodologies. And to be frank, there's also a lot of really bad interdisciplinary work out there, right? So and this doesn't help, because that, of course, then reinforces this idea that to be a good academic, you have to be a disciplinary academic. So I think, again, I don't think the problem is the student. They know what they want. I think also professional life that they go into, which is not academia, tends to be a bit more open to this. I think academia is not there, though.
Thank you very much, Josephine.
Okay, so now we have two new guest speakers. I'll start by introducing Mrs. Mafalda Damaso, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, which hosted this morning a panel on the power of culture in reimagining Europe. Am I right?
Yes.
So could you first of all very briefly tell us broadly to our audience what was discussed during this panel?
Of course, and it's also a pleasure to be here. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much for the invitation and for doing this. It's culture and knowledge. They're public goods, and the work that you're doing here shows that, and is a proof of that. So thank you for spending your time doing this. So we talked about different things. So we had Isabel Schwarz, who's head of public policy at the European Cultural Foundation, and she was talking about the work that the foundation does in terms of supporting the potential of culture in strengthening belonging, a sense of social cohesion and belonging. So they do lots of work, for example, with libraries all around Europe, because libraries are, in fact, community spaces as well, and they're spaces of encounter. We also had Pavel Zerka from the European Council on Foreign Relations, who has done work on cultural wars, and he actually wrote a really interesting report that looked at how the Americans, how Trump 2.0 is engaging in those cultural wars, and so we talked about that and how Europe should respond to that. Then we had Aurora Ham, who's a PhD researcher here in the history department, who talked about the ways cultural references, European cultural references, are used, manipulated by illiberal actors, and the need to actually engage with those conversations and to rethink what European culture and identity is, and they are, because if not, some other actors will do it. And then I talked about the potential of culture to be a bridge builder, and how we can get in museums, in cultural organizations, people that have different views around a table, and we can get them to talk. And in this very polarized world, that is much needed. So we talked about the contribution of culture to these complex problems like belonging, like the sense of identity, cultural wars, polarization. So I think it was a very rich conversation, but I'm biased though.
Maybe it's time to jump right on the spot and ask about Takara what maybe she thinks about that topic, because I understand that you were in a panel, you're an unexpected guest, you were in a panel that talks about universities, and you did something related to culture, am I correct?
Yes, you are correct. So I was in a panel in which we discussed the future of universities. And okay, go a bit closer. I was a part of this seminar at the UI called the University of Nowhere. And the point of the seminar was first to read very broadly about what education in the future could look like and about utopian possibilities. And then a second part of the seminar consisted in a creative writing project in which, together with researchers, postdoc, and a few professors such as Lorraine Lecausanet and Ben Carver from the Language Center, we imagined what this university of the future could be like. And specifically, we took inspiration from William Morris's piece, News from Nowhere, in which this British socialist writer and designer actually imagined a utopian place called Nowhere, which looks like Britain but also is really different in some other respects. And so the university was then called after this place. And yes, I am sorry I missed part of your comment before. I understand that it was on the culture wars. One thing that we were discussing, this is not about culture specifically, but maybe I can talk a bit about conflict in a sense and how we dealt with conflict in this seminar and in the University of Nowhere. Actually, we had a discussion about how much utopia should be ideal or should still show cracks, should show disagreement, people that maybe indeed manipulate certain references or try to have their way at this university. So in the way we solved that was to very strangely and creatively imagine that the university is actually crisscrossed by a series of tunnels that run under it, and people who are kind of seditious or who don't agree with some things can take refuge in those tunnels and maybe even dig further, like connect the university to the town. So I think one thing that we learned through this seminar is that utopia always includes conflict and always includes other issues, and that the way to portray them in writing, but also maybe in how we think about them, is not to totally exclude their possibility, but try to see them as a constituent part of what a university is like.
Yes, thank you very much, Chiara, for your reply back to Mafalda's feedback. But in the meanwhile, Professor Anton Hemrich at the Social and Political Science of the European University Institute has joined us. Welcome, Anton.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Happy to be here.
You were the other half, together with Giancarlo Corsetti, who has
Yes.
just been here, of the panel dedicated to European social model. And I'm inspired by the utopia that Chiara has just mentioned. Is social model still real or on utopia? We had some tweaks, some hints from Giancarlo, but Giancarlo we all know is an economist. You are a social scientist. So what is your take and what did you learn from this panel today?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I think we had a really good panel, very much forward-looking on many issues having to do with culture wars, actually, but also about aging, climate change, and how social policy could be sort of an important lever to improve the human condition in Europe. Now, on the utopia side, I mean, the thing is, in Europe we have pretty well established welfare states. So the social I have to go close. So the social commitments in Europe are relatively strong. They're not. I mean, they're not always sort of functional. So you know, more in the north than in the south. But that's a side point. So, in other words, this was a utopia, let's say in the 1930s, that was implemented in the 1940s and 50s, and the way it's been with us for such a long time gives it also quite a bit of resilience. You know, we have in Europe we have quasi-free education up to university. Everybody's guaranteed a basic pension when we grow old. And you know, if we're in the labor market and we are hit by something, you know, there's healthcare and there is unemployment benefits. So these things are really precious. So this is a utopia that has been put into practice, and it's very difficult to get away from. So there is already a way. So the will is about, you know, what comes next, and that's what we discussed.
I may, I have a follow-up question for you, Anton. We discussed before with Josephine Van Zeben the relationship between academia and policymaking, and there you bring some experience, right? So how did you manage this relationship between your work as a scholars and then trying to convince policymakers to do the right things in relation to what you put on paper as an evidence?
Okay, the way I think about sort of, you know, the interaction between us as academics and policymakers, and this is not to be arrogant, but basically what we can do for policymakers is to widen the repertoire of choice. Because policymakers are always obsessed, you know, what should I do now, tomorrow, given, you know, Trump is there, but, you know, maybe in half a year he's not so powerful anymore, we don't know. And that sort of pushes policymakers into quick fixes. So what I think we at EY should do, particularly on days like this, is to widen the repertoire of choice. You know, there are more roads to Rome than you can imagine, and this is something that I think we are good at. And if we can sort of supply also, you know, evidence to these roads that, you know, one way is a little bit more quicker or easier to travel than others, but others are worthwhile, but, you know, you have to face hurdles. That's also a contribution that we as academics can make.
Thank you very much, Anton. And this reminds me of fantastic hiking we did together a few years ago, right, because you mentioned roads and pathways. I would like to quickly go to Mafalda. Exactly about the wide of repertoire of choices. I'm quoting Anton. how we can use that in culture, because you mentioned there can be cultural wars, culture can divide. But here I'm interested to look at what, on the contrary, brings us together. I love fairy tales. And again, sorry for the ad, I have a radio show here on fairy tales and storytelling. And I noticed that Cinderella is the same across countries, and there are more than 300 versions. So on this fairy tales note, could you give us some hints to navigating
Yes.
these different pathways?
Of course. I mean, I'll give an example that I actually mentioned during the panel of an article that I published last year. And it was based on a piece that I read at The Guardian, where the journalist had interviewed the director of a museum in Germany, Wilke Wagner, and she's the director of a museum in Dresden, in Eastern Germany. And she was the target, long story short, of a far-right campaign, organic to some extent, but also partially, one can say, orchestrated by a tabloid, as a result of her decision and the museum's decision to showcase in the public sphere a sculpture by now I don't remember if it's a Syrian artist, I might be wrong, but it was not a German artist. And she was the target of a hate campaign. She received hundreds of emails, calls, and she was quite depressed, of course, and shocked, and did not act for a while. And then she decided, and this takes a very special kind of person, which would not be me. I don't think I would have that in me. But she decided at a certain point, after a few weeks of being extremely depressed, of actually calling back and those who had left their phone numbers and those emails. And so she called them back, and she said that actually, of course, there were some people with whom it was completely impossible to have a conversation. They just wanted to shout. But others actually had interesting points to make about the museum. So that the museum that she directs is a modern and contemporary art museum. And it's true, she recognizes that some of these people, when they said that they would like to see more art from Germany's past, it's true that the museum did not engage with that conversation. The museum was mostly focused on the present and on contemporary artists that is future-oriented. And so she decided, with her team, to invite those people into the museum. And she created a set of sessions called We Must Talk. Of course, there were clear guidelines in terms of how much time each person could say. There were things that could not be said, hate speech, etc. All of that was not present. But there was an attempt, and I think it was a productive attempt, as a scholar I can say that, to invite those people in, hear what they had to say, but then establish a bridge that is a bridge between some of the claims and the demands of these individuals who are part of the local community, and then the interests, the values, the claims of other individuals who are perhaps more progressive, who are also part of the community. And so, to give a specific example, she heard a lot that there would be a need or the desire for more German art from the past, and of course, the undertone of this was that there would be men, white men, that would be shown, right, as part of this understanding of the past. Nothing against it, but this was the assumption. And what she decided to do with her art historian fellows was to say, okay, let's showcase, let's think about what the past of Germany is, but let's also do it in ways that actually expand the canon of history of art, which is what the role of a museum is. So they showcase women dissidents, female artists, women artists who are dissidents and who were actually doing really interesting work in that period. So all of this to say, culture can be a bridge builder, and it can help us, it can create space for other narratives around our past, shared narratives. Because of course the result of those conversations was a set of exhibitions, and these exhibitions are relevant to different kinds of communities, right? That community that wants to see more about the past, and the community that actually want to hear different stories that expand the canon of new artists. And so it's not a traditional fairy tale to say that a museum can invite actors who are perhaps very hateful and in their original or first engagement with someone. but I think that it's a story that talks about the power of and the need for us to rethink what Europe is, what Germany is, what culture is, and to tell new stories. So I'm not sure if we need new fairy tales. I do think we need new stories and new narratives. But yeah, so that would be my answer.
Thank you very much, Mafalda.
It was a pleasure. I think we're moving on to the next panel, but it was a great pleasure to have you on our show. Thank you very much for these thoughtful answers. And thanks to Chiara for her unexpected joining of us on Radio Cavolo. Hi. We have now moving on to the next panel, and we have with us Euideas Dinas, which is joined by Professor Calypso Nicolaidis. Both of you were part of the same panel on Citizen Power Europe, which is a big word, and maybe for listeners would be good to start with describing very quickly what the content of the discussion has been in your panel.
Yes, thank you very much. So, yes, okay. So thank you very much for this. So I think I would not be the most appropriate person to describe this. How I think Calypso next to me is the heart, soul, and mind behind all this endeavor, which I think, by the way, was extremely successful, and I think that was the overall impression. The idea was to have a World Cafe, which to me was not a very well-known format for a panel, which, however, I think worked really well in the sense that it gave the opportunity to all participants engage actively in the key questions of the panel, which were about the problems that European democracy in particular, but more broadly democracy as a whole encounters in our days. And the idea was to try to think of them in terms of 5 themes or circles and see how we could bring in a more bottom-up way ideas about how to address some of the issues that came up in the discussion. So the purpose of this panel was both to bring in the surface, let's say, some of these key issues, and also to bring from, again, in at least more bottom-up fashion, ideas about how to address these issues.
Thank you very much, Elia. So welcome to Calypso Nicolaidis, professor at the School of Transnational Governance, and at the same time to Professor Shalini Randeria. Welcome to the 3 of you. You were together indeed in the panel. Follow-up question, Calypso. We have been working together for the last 6 years, I think. And for me, despite I'm not student anymore because of my age, but what inspires when I look at you is your engagement with students at the School of Transnational Governance, the Master in Transnational Governance, and we have been asking about next generation to most of our guests. So, what can you tell us? How do we motivate young people toward democracies? Maybe it was not so completely handled in the panel, but I want to capitalize on your great experience and engagement with the young generations.
Well, Elena, I wish that we were together in a classroom and then we could experiment, because I think that the best way to convey the challenge of democracy is to remind everyone and our students that democracy is an ongoing, messy, difficult experiment which has to reinvent itself all the time. And so in the classroom, the last thing you want to do is be the authority top-down, explaining to students that Tocqueville and Socrates and Weber and Schmidt, what they said. No, it's about students experiencing all sorts of ways in which they can reclaim their agency in the classroom as a metaphor for the classroom of life, for the classroom of democracy. And the way I do it in class is that my class on democracy is actually an ongoing experimentation with many methods of involvement. But what I do at the end convey is that we and it's not me motivating the students, it's as much the students motivating me, coming back to your question. And because together we become what we can refer to as a hive mind. A collective mind. It's not just a bunch of individuals that you aggregate randomly, but we learn to think together better than individually, yes, but through our very different preferences and fears and anguishes and dreams. And if we put all of them together, we put them together on Google Docs. We put them together through World Cafes. And I try to, in fact, today, we tried to reproduce a bit that spirit of the classroom, of learning together and teaching to each other, because at the end, my definition of democracy is how we each write ourselves in the collective story.
Thank you very much. Fascinating answer. Shalini Randeria, very nice to have you on Radio Cavolo. I wanted to ask you about the panel discussion, and given that apparently it's a hive mind experience, have you learned anything in that panel, and what did you come out of the panel with?
So we were discussing. It's okay? We were discussing several kinds of issues which ail European democracy. What are the kinds of democratic deficits? So some people were talking about the interface or the lack of interface and communication between politicians and citizens. Others were talking about how to scale democracy or democratic participation and decision making upwards or downwards. We had one group which was discussing the kinds of knowledge which would be needed, the interface, interactions between academia, policymakers, citizens. We had another group which was discussing questions of exclusion, of disenfranchisement at two kinds of levels. Poorer citizens all across European democracies who have stopped going to cast their vote. Also citizens who do cast their vote but are unable to participate beyond elections. There is a huge need to mobilize citizen participation into sustained engagement and involvement. And there was a discussion around how to include those refugees or residents who are taxpayers but not citizens, and giving them political rights so that they have a stake in democracy. Because what we have in Europe at the moment are hundreds of thousands of people, residents here, who pay taxes. They have taxation without representation.
Thank you very much for your reply. I wanted to ask, I understand we need to close, so can I still ask a question to the three guests?
We need to give this back.
It's all right.
So we continue and close this panel with Euideas. So my question is related to the 50th anniversary of the UI. Yesterday we did celebrate it at the theatre, Maggio Fiorentino in Firenze. Of course, we took stock of what the UI has been doing in its first 50 years, but we also look at what the UI could do in the second 50 years, looking at 2076. Is there a wish that you would like to share for the next 50 years of EUI experience with us?
I do
Thank
have
you.
a wish. Can I share my wish?
Yes.
My wish is that the administrative component of the UI grows equally as the academic one, because until now it has been growing disproportionately. And I think it is about time that it starts growing proportionally, and that more space and more, let's say, attention is given to the academic component of this. It tends to be the case that all celebrations of any type that we have somehow turn our identity more towards us as an international organization versus us as a university. And the UI is born as a university and will live and die as a university, in the sense that we will have to live and die as a university. We cannot transform ourselves into a think tank. I don't think this will be a way to survive in the long run. And I do think that there's been extremely interesting and important work and progress that has been taking place at the core of the academic content within the UI, which means that the 4 departments and the additional units, the Schumann and the STG, that needs to be highlighted more. So this is, to me, the wish. The wish would be to start looking at the academic output more as a university rather than as almost a byproduct of other things that we think bring value to our existence.
Thank you very much, Euideas. And yes, your words are very much interesting, because also you have un'esperienza pregressa here as research students. So you bring together, I believe, the alumni voices as well as the professor.
No, but this hasn't changed the way I think about this, in the sense that this is not as a residue of my previous, let's say, experience as a PhD student here, as a researcher. If anything, seeing the other side now of the having already for the last 8 years, having been positioned to see the other side of the curtain in a way, has reinforced, if anything, has generated this view to me. All I'm trying to say is that we are here in order, and we deserve to exist in order to level up excellence across the European continent, especially the periphery.
Thank you very much, Euideas. And while we say goodbye to you, Euideas, we say welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Anna Koppel. Anna Koppel represents an external voices. We have been hearing and listening and meeting several of the UI faculty members and researchers. Anna, you are coming from the International Development Law Organization. You have been here with us the entire day as participants of Euideas, the new research festival of the UI, and your organization is also a close stakeholder to the UI. Indeed, we have been exchanging a lot on how to combine research from a university, as Euideas was saying, together with an intergovernmental organization. So welcome and thank you for your time. I will kick immediately with a question whether you could introduce yourself and maybe giving a short introduction about IDLO, and then I give the floor to Alexander for some other questions. Thank you again.
Of course, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to participate in such an open dialogue. As you said, my name is Anna Koppel, and I am representing the International Development Law Organization, where I am currently Chief of Research. And just a few brief words about IDLO. We are an intergovernmental international organization headquartered in Rome, and our mandate is to promote and advance the rule of law across the world, with the linkages that, of course, it has for peace, stabilization, and democratic transitions.
Defending and upholding the rule of law worldwide, that seems like an ambitious goal in the current situation. Are you hopeful about the future of the rule of law? Because even in Western countries where we thought that the rule of law was very well entrenched, like not mentioning the United States, of course, but I have to, and even in Western Europe, we see some rule of law backsliding everywhere. Are you hopeful about the future of rule of law nevertheless? And maybe in a more global perspective, because we talk about Europe and the US a lot, but developments are not just in these areas.
Absolutely. I think in the current historical and political moment, it's difficult to be hopeful. And I think it's difficult to be hopeful in such a universal and global way. But I think that we have lessons that show us that just as democratization processes are a process of progress and retrenchment, so is the rule of law, and the two, of course, accompany each other. So even if things look bleak overall, you can always find spaces and pockets where actually there is progress forward. And you can take those lessons and you can see how you can adapt them and apply them in other places where there might be an opening to try something similar. And so I think that continues to drive hope forward. And there are contexts that are as complicated as, for example, Ukraine, where you see that even under the very practical, everyday reality of air raids, when there was a challenge to the independence of anti-corruption institutions, regular people, civil society came out to the streets to demand that that not happen. And I think that shows how hope for rule of law, for democracy, can live under the most difficult of circumstances.
Thank you very much, Anna. You mentioned that you are the head of research, and the Idea Law works in 40 countries, if I'm not mistaken. And here at the UI, we also, of course, as you know, we are a research-focused university, and we have 24 member states. My question is on the methodology. Because each country comes with its own research agenda, research methodology, and then I believe in the headquarters you have to do a kind of summary, allow me for this word, and how does it happen, and what are the challenges and the opportunities that you see in so much diversity? Thank you.
So we are implementing programmatic and operational interventions in the countries across the globe. What we try to do from the research perspective is we try to draw out the lessons from each programmatic experience, but given the particularities of the context in which that programmatic experience has been undertaken. So we learn contextually, and we try to extract lessons that could be applicable to other places, but always with the understanding that in any other place where they may be applied, the particularities and the context on the operational space will be very different. So we try to understand what are the conditions under which success is likely, or what are the conditions under which it's likely to face certain risks and challenges, and we present models that are based on our experiential work, but with the understanding that in any given situation, you will have to take into account the particularities, political, social, cultural, the history of the legal system and the way that it is evolving into the present. So any application has to be done with delicacy and an eye on what could potentially derail it in a different context. And we also try to engage with the plurality, not just of voices, but with the plurality of legal systems that exist across the world. And there has been a lot of work done in a number of African countries, for instance, bringing customary and informal justice systems into a more institutionalized kind of space that allows for greater access to justice, but also the recognition that people seek to resolve their disputes in a variety of different ways that could all be acceptable and are important for the capacity of people to get justice.
Fascinating. Maybe one last question before we wrap up. Here at the Euideas, we try to bridge research, knowledge, and policy making. As someone who is at part of a research institute but also tries to influence policy, how do you think your work is received, and what can you share a bit your experience about the policy impact of the work you conduct in your institute?
Question. And as I was saying, we try to create linkages that come from programmatic evidentiary experience, examine it through a research lens, and then repackage it into policy recommendations so that you have the real lived experience, but then you have the analytical aspect to it as well. we also try to work in a way that brings together different stakeholders and different actors. So we're not usually acting alone. And in terms of getting policy buy-in, that's a really important factor. When you have a plurality of voices kind of speaking to the same idea, international actors, civil society, donor institutions, for example, you get a lot more traction. And of course, we also work from the premise of national and local ownership. So we ensure that when we are beginning to even conceive a particular intervention that involves reform, that we are working within a context that's open to that reform going forward. So as that process unfolds, you then also have as champions the people who participated in making it happen. So it's not at all a simple process, and it involves many different variables and moving pieces, which again are specific to any given context.
Thank you very much, Anna. And this was very complementary with the discussion we had before with Euideas and Calypso. Very, very last question, because we cannot leave you without asking for wishes. I mean, you have been here at the UI today representing IDLO together with Silvia, that I say hello to her. And so we appreciate it very much. We're celebrating together. So what do you wish on behalf of IDLO to the next 50 years of the UI? Thank you.
Absolutely. So I was very moved by how frequently the words democratic spaces and their shrinking have been mentioned. And of course, universities have historically been protected, in essence, spaces for dialogue, for deliberation, for debate, for questioning what is even the meaning of truth and who determines what that is. And so I think EUI fits very well into that conception of what is academia, what is a university. But what I would like to wish you is that, with the understanding that your seat is in Florence, it's in Italy, it's in Europe, universities in this part of the world don't live for years, don't live for decades. They often live on for centuries. So I want to wish you not just another 50 years, but perhaps another few centuries, without naming any numbers, of continuing to be a space for dialogue, for debate, and for searching for the multiple truths that exist.
Lovely. What a lovely wish. So we do agree with that. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you again, and congratulations.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think we've finished our segment. We had a lot of different guests in a very short time, so this was a very productive hour together in
Indeed.
Radicavolo.
It was very fun. So there is a kind of sadness to leave the beloved radio patch, but eventually one day we'll be together again. Alexandre.
Hopefully.
Yes. Merci beaucoup for being together with me today.
It was a pleasure, Elena.
The same. Ciao.